Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Entry Point, where we take a deep dive into the latest entries from Encyclopedia Virginia with the contributors who wrote them. I'm Patti Miller, the managing editor of Encyclopedia Virginia, and I'm super pleased to be hosting today's program on Arthur Lee, the unknown revolutionary. For those of you who aren't familiar with Encyclopedia Virginia, we're the free, reliable multimedia resource that tells the inclusive history of Virginia for anyone who is seeking to understand how the past informs the present and the future. You can see all the entries we're discussing today on encyclopediavirginia.org, and I will drop a link into the chat about our new entry on Arthur Lee, who's the subject of today's entry point. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping notes. We will have time for questions at the end of this presentation with our special guest. And so please use the Q&A tab to put your questions in, and I will get to those for sure. And also, this event does have closed captioning, so you can use the more button at the bottom of your screen to set the closed captioning features. Now, today, I'm pleased to introduce our guest, Gordon Blaine Steffey. He held an endowed chair in comparative philosophy at Randolph College, formerly Randolph-Macon Women's College, before moving into the museum and public history fields at Stratford Hall, the historic home of the Lee family. He is now the Vice President of Research and Collections and the Director of the Jessie Ball DuPont Memorial Library at Stratford Hall. Welcome, Gordon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It is a delight to be here, and I'm sorry that my titles are so long. Right?
They're very impressive.
Oh
We want
yeah,
to get them all in there.
absolutely, absolutely. It's a delight to be here, and I'm happy to be able to talk about Arthur Lee, the unknown revolutionary. And that's great because it gives us an opportunity to talk about the revolution, not through the prism of the usual suspects, and we can talk a little bit about that at the end of my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for those of you who are on so that you can see my fancy little presentation here. How does that look? Great, thank you. Okay, so Arthur Lee, the youngest son, born 20th of December 1740 at Stratford. Stratford was still fairly new at that time. Arthur's father was the acting governor of Virginia colony, so he was born into privilege, of course. His parents, however, died when he was just a boy, 9, not quite 10. Both of his parents died in 1750, and this put him under the dominion of his eldest brother, Colonel Philip Ludwell Lee, called by the siblings Colonel Phil. Arthur had a significant number of siblings. I should just point this out because we're not going to have an opportunity to talk about all of his illustrious siblings today. That includes Richard Henry Lee, that includes Francis Lightfoot Lee, that includes Hannah Lee Corbin, and others, Thomas Ludwell Lee. We're just not going to have an opportunity to get to them. However, knowing anything about Arthur means understanding that Arthur was part of a broader network that included his family members and who coordinated on various political objectives as well as economic objectives. That's a very important thing to understand about Arthur. Anyway, he found himself under the dominion of his eldest brother, Colonel Philip Ludwell Lee, who was a bit of, shall we say, was a bit miserly. He maintained this graceless iron grip on the estate of their father and its resources, refusing really to allow his family members to inherit their legacies until all of their debts were paid off, which, by the way, never happened in Colonel Phil's lifetime. Here you see some of Philip's miserliness on view. He packed Arthur off to Eton College, where Arthur would receive an elite education. But of course, this stipulation that he was to have as little pocket money as ever any boy had, and rather less, meant that Arthur would have been placed in an awkward position at Eton among all of these social and political elites who were also attending Eton. He graduated Eton. And eventually, he moved on to the Royal Infirmary at Edinburgh, where he studied medicine. He was a brilliant student, Arthur. And by the way, Eton typically prepared people to be packed off to Cambridge or to Oxford as their next step. But in point of fact, a chance encounter with Dr. Samuel Johnson meant that Arthur instead went to Edinburgh, which Johnson recommended for people looking to obtain a quick, easy, efficient, and practical medical education. In fact, this was Arthur's first opportunity at politics in a way because he found that medical degrees were obtained a little too efficiently at Edinburgh, and he staged a student walkout when he discovered that medical degrees were effectively being conferred for pay to play at Edinburgh. In any case, he showed really flashes of his brilliance at Edinburgh. He won the first gold medal in botany, the John Hope Medal, for his thesis on Peruvian bark, also called quinine, which was a very practical medication for those who were in Virginia because of the malaria outbreaks that frequently occurred on some of these southern plantations. Moving on here. So Arthur really enjoyed his time in England. He was able to again rub shoulders with some of England's best and brightest. That included Arthur traveling on the weekends with Adam Smith to inspect the latest in agricultural techniques on surrounding farms in and around Edinburgh. So he was not particularly excited to return to the colonies. One of the principal reasons for his, as he put it, extreme aversion to returning had to do with his ideas about slavery. Um, Arthur was an early advocate of abolition, which kind of put him out of step, out of sync with his family, but also with out of step with a lot of Virginians. It's certainly the case that in London, where Arthur spent a good deal of time, about 1 in 250 people might have been an enslaved African. In Williamsburg, where he eventually returns, about half of the population were enslaved Africans and African Americans. So, nevertheless, he was persuaded to return, and return he did to Williamsburg by his brother Richard Henry Lee, who said, "Look, you owe it to your native soil to come back and to give your talents, spend your talents in assistance to your native soil," which at that time was embroiled in the Stamp Act controversies. And so Richard Henry Lee had this idea that he needed to come back and kind of apply his skills in the ongoing war with British overreach, which Arthur did. And so he returned and oh wait, let me back up here. Oh, yikes. Moving. I had a little too much. Oh gosh. Well, we'll stay here for now, actually. What I can say is that his article that he published on March 19th, 1767, which was an abolitionist argument, was not well received by his fellow Virginians, and a second planned installment of that article, in fact, was suppressed in Virginia papers. It put him on the outs with a lot of his fellow folks in Williamsburg, as well as with a lot of the Virginia planters. In fact, he really was not suited, by the way, to the life of a country doctor. This is what he very quickly discovered by being in Williamsburg, which, again, the population was under 5,000. The population of metropolitan London at that time was somewhere around 750,000. Arthur was just not suited to being a country doctor, having the kinds of experiences that he had in England specifically. Um, just made him kind of an ill fit for prescribing poultices and remedies to those who were sick and ill. And so while he's in Williamsburg and he runs afoul of a couple different folks who criticized his brother Richard Henry Lee for hypocrisy, and he gets literally into a fisticuffs with a man named James Mercer, and he's recuperating in his Williamsburg home. While he's there, the Townsend duties are implemented. And if you don't know about the Townsend duties, these are taxes on British imports in the wake of the Stamp Act repeal that again seek to put the burden of funding British coffers on Americans. Arthur reads John Dickinson and Letters from a Farmer, and he is moved deeply by what he reads. And so he decides that he's going to publish a series of essays intended really to supplement Dickinson's argument against the Townsend duties. And those series of articles come to be known as the Monitor Letters. And here you're looking at one of the lines from Monitor 10. The reason I like to pick out this particular Monitor letter, and by the way, those letters were published from February of 1768 to around April of 1768. This is the last year that Arthur spends in the colonies, and they are published repeatedly up and down in colonial newspapers. But Monitor 10 is interesting because, and I like to lift out this particular line, if only because we all know Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. I like to pull this one out because it's 7 years earlier. And it lets you kind of know where the Lee family was in terms of their attitude towards British political overreach, parliamentary overreach. Um, so he writes the Monitor series again to amplify and swell the arguments that he encountered in John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer. And it's while he's in bed recuperating this from this fisticuffs that he has that it occurs to him that really his life, that he is destined for politics. He doesn't want to sit on the sidelines as he experiences profound things happening. He's aware of these great political currents, and he wants to do more than, again, apply poultices to people in sick beds. He wants to be involved in the same way that his brothers and his sisters are involved. And so he hits upon this idea that he's going to go to Philadelphia and he's going to meet John Dickinson, which he does, and he's going to make friends with John Dickinson, which he does. And he's going to try to establish a correspondence network for all of the great men of the colonies so that they can kind of attempt to orchestrate their efforts in response to parliamentary overreach. And so he first stops in Philadelphia. He goes to New England we're not clear exactly who he met while he was in New England, but he sails for London. He returns to London again, which was for him kind of returning to something that he knew, something familiar, something that excited him. He returns in 1768, late 1768. And one of the first things that he does when he gets off the ship in London is he goes to meet probably the greatest celebrity of the day, who at the time was locked up in the King Bench's prison, and that is John Wilkes, the Lord, who will become the Lord Mayor of London. And a member of Parliament for Middlesex later. But at the time, Wilkes was imprisoned for seditious libel in King Bench's prison. And Wilkes was a popular character. He was someone who appealed both to elite radicals as well as to the working class, and partly because Wilkes was they saw Wilkes as kind of the icon of the struggle against the system, the struggle against the establishment. And so Arthur visits Wilkes in prison and ultimately becomes a great friend of Wilkes and the American gatekeeper for other Americans who want to go and visit Wilkes. And it's by sort of engaging with Wilkes and the people around Wilkes that Arthur is able to really join American grievances to London radicals, working class grievances in London, which is what Arthur's trying to do. He's trying to get folks in London, in England specifically, to see that, wait a second, our grievances aren't so different as those from the folks in the distant colonies. I think a measure of Arthur's success in this response is in this respect is that the Middlesex Petition of 1769, which is specifically a document that was crafted to, call for parliamentary reform in the wake of Parliament's refusal to seat John Wilkes, who had been elected MP for Middlesex. But the very last petition in the Middlesex petition, which you see here, the very last petition, is this idea that there's a similarity between metropolitan grievances and colonial grievances. You see that here. And that is certainly a result of Arthur's involvement with Wilkes. Arthur will later become the secretary of the Society for the Bill of Rights in London, which is a pro-Wilkes advocacy group. And Arthur really is their chief ideologue. And again, this is a group who is pushing for significant parliamentary reforms. John Wilkes will later begin to achieve some significant parliamentary reforms once he's seated. Now, Arthur understands, again, he's still a doctor. He has his medical degree from Edinburgh, but he decides at this point that it's time to go back to school, which he does. He returns to study law now at the Middle Temple in London, where he held his rooms. He's already becoming a writer, an activist about colonial American grievances, Virginia grievances. It's also around this time, around 1770 or so, that Arthur has come to the attention of radicals in New England, specifically Sam Adams. And Sam Adams puts Arthur forward for deputy colony, who actually puts him forward for colony agent of Massachusetts Bay. In fact, that position, that post goes to Benjamin Franklin, but Arthur is appointed deputy colony agent for Massachusetts Bay. So here you have this radical Virginian living in London, representing in a deputy post the Massachusetts Bay and their interests to Parliament. It's great because it's around this time too that Arthur suggests to Sam Adams that hey, wouldn't it be great if we could get all of the, again, important members of the elite in the various colonies to correspond with one another and to coordinate their political action. Sam Adams is going to take that idea and run with it, creating committees of correspondence, which then become the first form of shadow government before they're replaced by colonial governments. Um, During this time, again, Arthur's writing significantly pro-American advocacy in the British newspapers, which are then also turning up in colonial newspapers. But it's about around the time 1775 that Arthur writes to the South Carolinian Ralph Izard. There's a silence in the New England provinces, which argues an approaching storm. Um, this is an understatement because, of course, on the 19th of April in 1775, one of the things that you might know, all of you, is that shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. Now, Arthur becomes a big player in the events of Lexington and Concord to the extent that after shots are fired at Lexington and Concord, the Committee of Safety, managed really effectively by Dr. Joseph Warren, who will later become a revolutionary general, Warren and the Committee of Safety there decide that one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to try to beat the British to the press on sort of their version of events. What happened? What really happened at Lexington and Concord? So they take a significant number of depositions from people who were actively involved in the engagement, and they put them on a fast boat and they sail those depositions in some of the local papers with a letter from Joseph Warren. They sail it to London, and they are intending to place it in the hands of Benjamin Franklin. Again, remember, who was the chief colony agent for Massachusetts Bay. But by that time, Franklin's actually in the middle of the Atlantic. He's returning to the colonies. I always like to say when shots were fired, Franklin had no idea because he was on a boat in the middle of the ocean. But so when this packet of information arrives in London, right? Like, hey, beat the British to the press on this. They have to place it in the hands of the deputy colony agent for the Massachusetts Bay, and that's Arthur Lee. Arthur Lee then publishes, as you see here on May 29th of 1775, an extraordinary and extra edition of the London Evening Post in which he provides a significant account of what happened at Lexington and Concord, drawn in part from the Essex Gazette, drawn in part from the depositions that were posted to him by Warren and the Committee of Safety. He is disputed the next day by the British ministers who say, this isn't true. We need to wait. Let's not get excited. We're not sure what happened yet. In point of fact, the British version of events, what I like to call the red-coated version of events, hadn't yet arrived in England. So no one really knew what happened apart from this London Evening Post extra, which breaks the news, and people are beside themselves about what's going on in the colonies. So they post a rebuttal, and then that same day, Arthur Lee, using his friendship with the Lord Mayor of London at that time, now John Wilkes, decides to checkmate the ministry by saying, look, you don't believe me? You don't believe what you read in the papers? I'm going to post the original depositions on file in Mansion House with my good friend, the Lord Mayor of London, John Wilkes. And so he does. He says, like, anyone who wants to see for themselves what happened at Lexington and Concord can go check at Mansion House. They're on file there. This is a nice little reserve, right? Um, so it's, and by the way, I will say that one of the things that Arthur does brilliantly in this period is that he hammers the British press. I mean, he has about, I would say, 2 weeks to hammer the ministry in the British press before the red-coded version of events arrives. And I'm sure you can guess that the red-coded version of events is that the colonists fired first. But for 2 weeks, Arthur Lee hammers the ministry in the papers and gets a lot of folks on board who can't believe that this, in fact, has happened. One of the things that Arthur has been doing over the years that he's been in London from 68 to now 1775 is publishing on colonial grievances and American advocacy pieces for years under a wide variety of pseudonyms, some of which you see here. Raleigh, Junius Americanus, perhaps one of his most famous. Monitor, yes, a photo false prophets. My favorite pseudonym happens to be the one in the upper right, which is an old member of parliament. He was none of those things. He was neither old nor was he a member of parliament. But nevertheless, and by the way, this makes it very difficult for us to enumerate the actual number of pro-American advocacy pieces that Arthur publishes because we can't track down all of the pseudonyms that he's using. He will later tell John Adams, listen, you've got to use the press because it's a brilliant political instrument. Today we know that. But at the time, it wasn't as well understood. Arthur understood it well, and he also understood that it was to his advantage to use pseudonyms so that everyone couldn't just dismiss information that was sort of coming out of the papers as, oh, this is just that Arthur Lee again. Um, I will say that I believe, and I think I mentioned this in the Encyclopedia of Virginia article, is that we know that between 68 and 76, Arthur wrote a minimum, and again, this is really a conservative estimate, a minimum of 170 pro-American essays, averaging around 750 words, 9 pamphlets, one of which went through 4 editions. That's the one that you see here in the upper right. I mean, we can say that, I mean, quite confidently that something of Arthur Lee's work appeared somewhere in the papers in all of the 91 months that he lived in London, which is incredible. I mean, it's a torrential output of advocacy writing. And by the way, to a certain extent, this wasn't lost on some of the folks in England. This happens to be my favorite quote, which happens just a little while, you can see here after the Lexington and Concord, right? You have this antiquary named Thomas Falconer writing to a member of Parliament saying, "Look, they might act as they pleased in America if we were united at home, but the American Party with Arthur Lee as a writer have got possession of the newspapers. This Lee was bred up to physic, turned lawyer, now finishes as a rebel, probably the chief incendiary of Virginia, and he's on this side of the Atlantic. Why can't we go get him?" In other words. Um, London was becoming dangerous for Arthur and for his brother William Lee, who was also there. It was becoming dangerous for Americans. Again, that approaching storm, shots fired. Arthur really did have his hand on controlling the narrative while he was there. Um, he really knew how to seize the moment, and he knew how to seize the instruments that were at his disposal to make an impact for the American colonies in London. Uh, when the Committee for Secret Correspondence was formed, which was really to become the first kind of diplomatic arm, also espionage arm of the revolutionary government, the first letter that was written by the Committee of Secret Correspondence, which was at that time chaired by Benjamin Franklin, was a letter of recruitment to Arthur Lee, because of course Arthur Lee had been spying and really using his intelligence networks to convey information about what was going on in London, in England, to his allies back home, which included the Adamses in Massachusetts. It included Dickinson in Pennsylvania. It included his brothers back home in Virginia. As London became very, very dangerous, and last thing I'll say about his time in England is that it was while he was in England and while he was at the house of his good friend, again, Lord Mayor Wilkes, that he encountered a French political operative by the name of Caron de Beaumarchais. And it was Beaumarchais that Arthur convinced to advocate for the American cause with French Foreign Minister Vergin and ultimately with Louis XVI. And it was through Arthur Lee that the French government was persuaded to start supplying the first material covert aid to American troops in the field. That's extremely important. It's often overlooked because later it will be taken over. That role will be taken over by Silas Deane. But as we near the end of 76, Arthur is transferred. He's appointed commissioner to co-commissioner to the royal government of Louis XVI in Paris, and he becomes a co-commissioner with Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane at the French court. And they spend 2 years attempting to secure a treaty of amity and alliance. During those 2 years, by the way, France is supplying covert commercial and material economic aid to American revolutionaries. In February 6th of 1778, Arthur, Franklin, and Deane all are party to the signing of the Treaty of Amity and Alliance with France, which brings the French openly into the Revolutionary War on the American side, which is an absolutely critical moment, a decisive moment in the war. There was, as I know we're going to talk about this, so I won't say too much about it now, but there was significant friction between the co-commissioners while they were in France, much of it had reflecting political frictions back home. I mean, so the friction that you see in France is really a reflection of the friction that you see back home in the Continental Congress between the radical faction in Congress, the Adams and the Lees, and the more moderate conservative faction run by Robert Morris and others. But here's the ink dried on the Treaty of Amity and Alliance of 1778. You see there the signatures of Franklin, Deane, and Arthur Lee. Arthur held a number of minor posts after 1780. He returns to the colonies around 1780, 1781, and he takes up a number of other posts. He serves in Congress. He serves on the Board of Treasury. These are minor political appointments. Part of the reason he's serving in such minor roles is because of the fallout from the Lee-Deane affair that occurred in France. But he serves with distinction until such time as he decides it's time to get out of the political game altogether and retire to a farm that he's purchased here in Southern Virginia. And this is, of course, his home, Lansdowne, which is now in Urbana. You can go and visit. It's commemorated as the home of Dr. Arthur Lee, behind which is his gravesite, well preserved. What I can say is that if you want to talk about later assessments and contemporary assessments of Arthur Lee and his impact on the American Revolution, on the achievement of independence, I've drawn out a couple of quotes here that I think are worth mentioning. I'll start with a contemporary, Samuel Adams, which is the second quote here. He says that Arthur Lee will have them, banks, plaudits, whatever, when the trustees of the public shall have fortitude enough to be uninfluenced by great names and characters given to men of base and depraved minds. You will ask when that will be. Perhaps not in this age, but the historian will in some future time draw forth the proofs of his patriotism, and unprejudiced posterity will acknowledge that Arthur Lee has borne a great share in defending and establishing the liberties of America. John Adams, and this is a long time after Lee has died. Lee dies in 1792, but in 1819, John Adams is reflective about the role of his former colleagues and allies. And he says, Arthur Lee, a man on whom I cannot think without emotion, a man too early in the service of his country to avoid making a multiplicity of enemies, too honest, upright, faithful, and intrepid to be popular, too often obliged by his principles and feelings to oppose Machiavellian intriguers to avoid the destiny he suffered. This man never had justice done him by his country in his lifetime, and I fear he never will have by posterity. His reward cannot be in this world. I personally have always liked Richard Henry's, which is just that, if all men were like him, tyrants would have no existence. As for Arthur, this was his own kind of assessment of his life and service. He says to his nephew, my zeal for liberty and my country made me sacrifice all my prospects. to embrace their then perilous and doubtful cause. Yet I cannot think if I were again placed in the path of brilliant prospects, which I quitted, that I could hesitate to make the same sacrifice. All right, I think I've gotten close to my time limit. That was a lot. I don't know how I can do that in so short a time, but I think we've almost gotten there. And so I want to thank you for listening to a little bit about Arthur Lee. And you can hear more on my podcast, which is produced by Stratford Hall. And we do a little number with letters, the archives of Stratford Hall. We try to keep it all under 20 minutes. So if you have time and interest to listen to more about Arthur Lee or any of his illustrious siblings, please check that out and feel free to contact me. Meantime, that's it, and thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. That was amazing. And yeah, it is a huge overview in a very short time that really touches on every facet of the revolution, which
It
is,
does.
I have to say, in working, as I was mentioning to you previously, Encyclopedia Virginia is doing a large section of content on the American Revolution in Virginia. We will ultimately produce about 100 entries touching
Hmm.
on biographies and various aspects of the revolution. Few have surprised me as much as reading about Arthur Lee and that he is so little known and that you'd think he would be better known. I have dropped into the chat for folks who are interested our biographies of his brothers, Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee, as well as his sister, Frances Corbin Lee. Sadly, Arthur's was the fourth of the family to get his bio published, but now it is published. So, talk a little bit about why he isn't better known among the revolutionary luminaries that he certainly seems to belong among.
Yeah, in fact, I mean there's a case to be made that he may be important, more important than some of his other brothers. Probably, I've always been struck by something that John Adams said in a letter to Benjamin Rush. I'm sure many are familiar with it, but in 1790, Adams says to Rush in a letter, "The history of our revolution will be one continued lie from one end to the other." And he goes on to say, I mean, and you all know this famous part, right? The essence of the whole will be that Dr. Franklin's electrical rod smote the earth, and out sprung General Washington. Franklin electrified him with his rod, and thenceforward those two conducted all the policy, negotiations, legislation, and war, right? I mean, this is um, and what Adams is talking about, and what he will be talking about in 1819 when he's reflecting on Arthur Lee's service. What he's talking about is the tendency of history to be sclerotic, the tendency of history toward mythology, the tendency of history toward omission, that we reduce the revolution and the variety of levels at which people worked to make it happen. Um, and just down to this, like these heroes, Washington striding boldly across, battlefields, Franklin doing this great. I mean, you and I were talking earlier, Patty, about the great series on Apple Television Plus, right? Franklin, which the tagline for which was, how Franklin saved America, which again, there's that overstatement that makes Adams roll in his grave. So I think on the one hand, it's just a general tendency that we find in history. On the other hand, I think it's also the case that all of the Lee brothers, every last one of them, was dead before 1800. And they did not live like Madison, Jefferson, or Adams to curate their legacies. They did not live long enough to raise up a band of advocates who would then go on to curate their legacies for them. And again, but I will go back to just this idea that we like to reduce very complicated stories to the achievements of great actors, and we end up doing a disservice to those who fought like Arthur Lee, tooth and nail, for the independence that we now enjoy. I mean, I think Adams was brilliant to already pick up on the currents of this in 1790, right? I think he was also probably complaining about his place in that story, but yeah, there's the answer. There's my answer.
Yeah, and that's especially interesting because Adams is not one to give praise easily, and that's really effusive praise for John Adams. It's like, wow, if John Adams is saying that, that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, well, we all know that, Adams had his trouble with Franklin, and Lee had his trouble with Franklin, but Adams was equally critical. I mean, if you go back to Adams' letters and journals from the period, I mean, he was tough on Lee. He thought that Lee was too. I mean, he had a quick temper. He thought that Lee was a little bit, in some ways, too upright, right? That he was uncompromising, and he was uncompromising, which got him into hot water often. But yeah, the high praise from Adams, both Adams, I would say Sam Adams, and another aspect of this is, and that I should have mentioned when I was pulling out the Sam Adams quote. When Sam Adams is accused by some of Silas Deane's advocates of being Arthur Lee's friend, Adams replies, "My friendship for him is not rooted in the private. It's rooted in the public, right? It's rooted in the public interest." Adams really believed that Arthur Lee was a principal mechanism for the achievement of independence. And yeah, so there it is.
Talk a little bit about his role as a propagandist. What I find really extraordinary about him, and perhaps it had to do with his time in London, but he seems to grasp the importance of newspapers, as you said, the importance of what we would call now flooding the zone with these opinion pieces from all these different people, and how important it was to get some people in England on our side. I mean, you don't think about that. Is that kind of propaganda across the ocean there? He's not a modern man. How was he so intuitive? How did he know? I mean, he studied medicine first and then law to understand what we would understand about modern media and modern, propaganda. How did he know that in that era? He seems like he was so ahead of his time in that capability to influence public opinion.
Yeah, again, he was very, I mean, again, so much so that he will later, give John Adams pointers on how to use the press to, right? I mean, and one of the things that he'll say to Adams is like, don't do it directly, come at them sideways. He'll say, try to push on other areas so that you're not seen as kind of a demagogue. I think partly because he was a lawyer, and partly because he was trying to. I mean, he felt like he was playing catch up a lot of his life because he had already had a career before he had another career. So he's always trying to play catch up by reading, understanding, and he also sees. I mean, again, he's playing a very significant role in the Wilkes movement. He's the secretary for the Society of the Bill of Rights, which is this advocacy group. So, and that group is regularly to be found in the papers. Their opponents are to be found in the papers. So he's kind of trained up on how to use the papers through the Wilkite movement, and he will come to use that effectively as the revolution ramps up. And again, I think it will one of the reasons people tend not to value that or assess it too highly is because folks will say, well, it didn't work, did it? I mean, he was trying to get Britons on side, but it didn't work, did it? Well, it didn't. It didn't. I mean, he had his network of folks for whom what he was saying and what he was doing was very effective, including people like Lord Shelburne, right, who was at some point also advocating, I mean, against British overreach vis-a-vis the colonies. So he was very savvy, and he by the way, he also took a lot of lessons from John Wilkes to the extent that lessons that Ben Franklin couldn't have learned. And one of the reasons I bring that forward is because Franklin saw Wilkes as a sort of kind of gross and detestable libertine, cross-eyed libertine, which he was. But nevertheless, Arthur understood that Wilkes could be used, right? Because Wilkes appealed both to London radical elites as well as to, how shall I say, the working class. I mean, Wilkes was a popular hero, and he was a hero. Oops, gosh, my camera's gone. Sorry, and he was a hero to the working class, and I think that made Arthur take some significant lessons from that.
And what do you think? It seems some of his most successful work was when he was in overseas.
Hmm.
In Virginia, when he comes back, he's very much an outsider. It's not cosmopolitan by any means, as you know.
Yeah.
And his stance on slavery really does make him, even among his family, among the elite of Virginia, such an outsider. How did that affect him? That he seems like when you read about him, he's always on the edges of things, which he did use to I think, his benefit in some ways.
He did. I think that yeah, it's really fascinating. His relationship with slavery, which was de rigueur in the Northern Neck where he hailed from, I mean, he was an outsider to his family to the extent that, I mean, he's writing letters to his brother Richard Henry, telling him, "Listen, you have to stop talking about slavery in public because you're making yourself look like a giant hypocrite." Right? You can't espouse, you can't say that you're against slavery and then hold slaves, right? Hold the enslaved. So he does use this to his advantage both at home and abroad. I think he goes away at age 9. He spends that time at Eton. He spends that time at Edinburgh. He'll later spend time at London. In some ways, that Arthur was made to be a transatlantic connection for the Lee family. In the same way that I think I mean, one of the things I don't talk about today is that the majority of the time that Arthur is in London, his brother is also there, William Lee. That's his next oldest brother. Arthur works to get William Lee elected sheriff of London, which is by the way, and I bring this forward. This is an incredible feat. In the year 1774, the two sheriffs of London, and there were only two, were both Americans. One of them, Stephen Sayre, the other, William Lee. Both of them really vaulted into that office on the back of Arthur Lee, who mobilized the Society for the Bill of Rights, that Wilkite movement, to get Americans elected. So you have two American sheriffs and John Wilkes, Lord Mayor of London. Arthur is he was he I think he liked being in the shadow, being able to work a little bit behind the scenes, right? Which is what kind of writing allowed him to do, as well as right, being the secretary of the Society of the Bill of Rights, working in the streets. He was a confrontationalist, and he didn't, for example, like Benjamin Franklin's approach in London. I mean, what Franklin's approach was kind of like soft power. I'm gonna make friends with these elites, and I'm gonna persuade them to my cause. And that really comes to a screeching halt when Franklin is holed up in the cockpit in London, and then kind of hightails it out of London, and Arthur is left there on his own. But Arthur understood that the only way to really confront Parliament was to confront them and under a wide variety of voices and mechanisms.
And so talk a little bit about Dean and Lee and Franklin. They're serving these incredibly important roles, but are kind of at each other's throats the entire time. As you said, some of it's personality. You also mentioned some of it's just fundamental differences of the factions back home about how they're approaching the revolution.
Yeah.
Was someone right or wrong, or was it the mix of those three that was necessary to get done what they had to get done?
Was someone right or wrong? Yes. Someone was right and someone was wrong. But who was it? It was Congress. Um, Adams later will make the suggestion to Congress, look, three commissioners doesn't work. You need one. And Congress will agree with that. And partly as the result of the fallout of the three co-commissioners. But they made a mistake because the commission reflected really fissures in Congress, and they knew it and should have taken steps to do something about it, but they didn't. And by the way, they were all very different. Franklin, again, is applying this soft power technique. I mean, he was playing really you know, philosopher sage from the backwoods while he was in France, with the coonskin cap. And, even Adams, when Adams replaces Silas Deane and goes over to Paris, I mean, Adams will complain that Franklin spends all of his time right behind closed doors being, entertaining the ladies. And I think Adams says something about allowing them to pat his bald head or something like that. And Lee complains about this too. Like, I can't get an appointment with Franklin because there are always people on the door. I can't go in to see him. He's not sharing information. That's one thing that we know about Franklin. He played everything close to the chest. That's not something Arthur was used to when he arrived in Paris, working with people who were keeping secrets from him or weren't being transparent with him about what was going on. So that was a source of the tension with Franklin. With Dean, it was something else. It was the transparency issue, but it was also the fact that Lee understood that Dean was making commission off of commercial shipments that he was arranging for the American war effort. So, and I mean, today we would call that an emolument, right? Arthur had deep objections to the idea that you could get rich at the same time as helping the American war effort. That was really a source of his contention with Dean. The other, I think, one other sort of personality aspect would be that to a certain extent, Franklin and Dean were both what you might call self-made men. And Arthur was the junior member of an elite Virginian family. And I think there were frictions there. But ultimately, in the end, I think the problem was there wasn't sufficient transparency and collegiality among the commissioners. They were each kind of looking out for their own interests in the way that they thought best and refused really to collaborate in a way that would have, look, it was a success, right? One way or another. By the time you get to February of 1778, there's a Treaty of Amity and Alliance, and the French come into the war. But it was hell to get there. And part of I mean, I think the real tragedy here was that it was openly known that the commissioners were at each other's throats. And that was an embarrassment to Congress. It was also a reflection on what Congress had done in appointing the three of them. But the bad blood, I mean, as to who was right or wrong among the three, I think they were all wrong. I think Franklin should have done a little bit more to bring his juniors into this collaborative or putatively collaborative endeavor. I think he should have done more, certainly, to keep tabs on what Dean was doing. Dean did not keep good accounts. He did not keep good records. This is one of the chief complaints of Lee, is that there were no records. The other complaint, and I'll say this in Arthur's defense, is Arthur was saying, "Hey, listen, this embassy is riddled with spies. There are spies all over. That guy over there is a spy." And the guy that he meant chiefly was Edward Bancroft, who Franklin and Dean were intimate with, and who they would not listen to Lee. No, there's no way Dr. Bancroft is a spy. And of course, what do we learn later in the 19th century? That all of the secrets of the American embassy were going out the door. Most of them were going out the door with Dr. Edward Bancroft. So Lee was right about Bancroft, but he couldn't put the evidence together to convince Franklin. And Franklin really, to be honest, wasn't interested. This is one of I mean, Franklin's own strategy for dealing with problems of spying was that he was just going to play everything close to his chest. If I don't tell anyone anything, then no one can know anything. Uh, but again, that's not helpful for collaboration and collegiality. So it was a mess. Dean gets recalled. And of course, when Dean arrives home and Congress isn't as responsive to Dean as Dean wants them to be, he decides that he's going to go ahead and let the cat out of the bag about what happened in Paris in the colonial newspapers, in the newspapers at home. This gets Congress involved. Lee will never actually officially be recalled, but he's effectively recalled to the extent that they take Adams' suggestion and reduce the commission to one member, and that's Franklin.
A few questions from the folks who've joined us. Someone asks in Stacy Schiff's book about Franklin in Paris, she implies that Franklin was better at understanding the French culture, while Arthur Lee sort of failed to read the room. What are your thoughts about Lee in Paris?
I agree with you. I agree with Stacy Schiff to an extent. I think that Franklin, in a way, I don't know, I also want to say Franklin got a little lucky on this, but I mean, he liked the frontier sage routine did not work in London, right? It failed in London. And Arthur Lee took that failure to be a vindication of his own method, which was this kind of militia diplomacy that Adams will talk about later, right? This we are brash, we are bold, we are confrontational, in a way that Adams would be in the Netherlands. Um, and I think that Arthur Lee and he was used to working with Wilkes. He was used to working with Wilkites in the streets of London. So he was a confrontationalist. He was not this kind of like, I'm going to sit around and wait on the pleasure of His Majesty. Franklin was perfectly content to do that. And I think that was the best approach, obviously. It's very clear that Arthur Lee alienated the French by the time that the treaty was signed. However, the only thing I would say is that it was in 1776 that Arthur Lee brought the French on board in the first place. Covert aid, right? He was the one who first started that channel of secret covert aid. So he's the one, and it was his insistence and his confrontationalism with Beaumarchais that brought the French on board. Arthur would use language that was alienating. I mean, he would say, I think he said something like to Beaumarchais, like, is France determined to remain the laughing stock of Europe? Now, this isn't the way you would think, okay, well, this is someone you want to supplicate, like, oh, you're so amazing, you're so great. We really love your help. You could really be so great. No, instead he says, like, are you really going to, remain a laughing stock of Europe by not getting involved on our behalf? It wasn't the right approach in the long run. Franklin had that right approach, but I think we have to give Lee credit for bringing the French on board initially.
For opening the door there, yeah.
Yeah.
Someone else had a question. Lee advocated against slavery while being supported by personally owning slaves. I don't think he personally owned slaves because he was the youngest son, but explain that a little better.
Yes. So there is some evidence that by the end, I mean, the only thing I know about this particularly is that there's a suggestion that in 1792 he purchased two enslaved men to come work at Lansdowne, which he had acquired. Now there are any number of ways to look at this. I'm not sure that there's a good way to look at it, apart from so many people fail to live up to their own ideals. But the other thing is that Lee's, at least his abolitionism was so absolute that he was regularly sought out by abolitionists like, for example, Anthony Benezet, the Quaker abolitionist from Philadelphia, by Granville Sharp from England. There's no evidence that Arthur ever departed from his opinions, um, and he didn't let his brother Richard Henry off the hook on Richard Henry's claim that, look, I'm not going to deny my family the benefits that come from owning enslaving people in Virginia. I'm not going to deny my family if we're going to have this system, then I'm going to make sure that the benefits flow to my family. If that's ultimately what Arthur resorted to, I mean, he would have said that he failed to live up to his own best insights.
And like most of the elite revolutionaries, although it was the position in his family where he didn't inherit the bulk of his estate. That went to the older
Right.
brothers. Um, Obviously the
I mean,
Lee
he only
family
inherited money. He only
inherited
inherited
money,
money,
and that
which he
that
never
money.
received.
Oh, and he never received, right? The money, but the position and the everything he enjoyed in life obviously did come because his larger family were enslavers, although he
Yes.
was not. It also made it possible for him to stand outside of that a little bit because he didn't personally inherit the slaves. He did not personally inherit the estates. He
Correct.
got some money, which he never got. So he was kind of the junior partner in that, but yet he was still obviously complicit in that system, which, as you say, he tried to both fight against and move the colony away from that after the war when there was some evidence that you could move towards gradual emancipation like the northern states did, but did not
And
happen.
I would say, just as an addendum to that, he really retires from the issue. I think once he publishes this article in the Gazette, which and has this second installment prepared and ready to go, I think once that second installment is suppressed, he really kind of retires his own activism in the issue, right? He says, "I leave this to better minds." I don't think that's a cop out. I think he was interested more in other political currents than just continuing to, fight, swim against the tide in Virginia on the issue of slavery. But it was also not doing him any favors in Virginia, where at the time he was currently residing. He never, I mean, as late as 1774, he espouses the very same opinions that he espouses in 1767 when Granville Sharp sends him a selection of his own writings and says, listen, I read yours with interest and I want to share mine with you. But I think that yeah, if he as some records, I've never seen the original documents, so I don't know. I don't know for a fact, but I do know that there is at least um, a transcribed version of a purchase agreement between Arthur Lee and one of his brothers for two enslaved carpenters. Yeah. So if he did that, this would be a failure because typically Arthur was uncompromising in almost every respect. If he made that compromise, it would, yeah.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Gordon.
My pleasure.
Please be
Thank you for
on,
listening.
please, you can take a deeper dive into learning about Arthur Lee in our Encyclopedia of Virginia entry. And also, Arthur has a forthcoming, I'm sorry, Gordon has this forthcoming book about Arthur Lee. So look forward to that. And also, if people are interested, Stratford Hall in the Northern Neck is an amazing place to visit.
Please
It
come.
is the Lee family home. It is the birthplace, most famously, of Robert E. Lee. And it's just a really one of the unique Virginia historical treasures that people should take advantage of visiting. Thank you for everyone for joining in. If you found today's event valuable, please consider becoming a donor to Encyclopedia Virginia so it makes it possible to keep us online at a
It's a
time
great
of
resource.
as a time of decreased federal funding for the humanities. You can also stay up to date on all our latest entries that are coming out on the revolution and everything else by becoming a subscriber to our monthly newsletter. And I will drop a link to that in the chat as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us, Gordon. And we look forward to seeing you for the next entry point. Thank
Yeah.
you so much, everybody. Bye
Bye
bye.
bye now.